All right, welcome to Homiletics Masters, the final. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Feel free to print one of these out and record, write down whatever notes that you feel are appropriate. Fast forward, rewind as necessary, and we're just going to work our way through this, all right? So let's start with number one. Explain the significance of Exodus 34. This is Moses' revelation of God. If you remember, Moses was on Mount Sinai, and he says, Lord, I want to know you. And God says, I have a place beside me in the cleft of the rock, and the Lord hid him there, covered him, and then the Lord passed over him. What is the significance of that for the importance of preaching? I think what's significant there is that Moses has this revelation of God, but what he records is not what God looks like, but he records what God said. And so I believe that shows the power of the words of God. And that when Moses says, Lord, I want to know you, God gave him a revelation, but what Moses recorded that struck him out of this revelation was what God said. And so I think there's an importance there to the Word of God, particularly towards us, that we cannot see the Lord and live, but what the Lord has given us is the power of His words, right? Okay. Number two, how is Moses' revelation of God on Mount Sinai also a picture of Christ? So, kind of what I'm looking for here in this is that Moses had asked God to see His glory, right? And so, God's answer to that was to speak to him, right? So God, Moses says, Lord, I want to see your glory, and what God does is he speaks to him. And so I think there's a connection there between that and John chapter 1, where it says, we beheld the wonder of his glory, the only begotten of the Father. And he's talking about how the Word was made flesh there in that beginning, and he's talking about how the Word was made flesh, and we beheld the wonder of his glory. So there's a connection there between the glory of God and His Word in John chapter 1, when John is describing Jesus, and also here in this image in Moses' day, where Moses asked to see the Lord's glory, and what he got was God's spoken word. And I believe that is a picture of Christ. Number three, sermons are first and foremost filled with words. All right, so we talked about that quite a bit, that ultimately you must become a wordsmith. Number four, explain the relevance of the example of a child learning to speak with the preaching event, right? So what is the relevance of that example of a child learning to speak to the preaching event? What I'm after here is I gave you an example towards the beginning of how when a child learns to speak and to communicate at an early age, they are associating words with concepts. And as their vocabulary is increased by having these words connecting in their brain with concepts, then their comprehension and ability to communicate and to understand increases. That same phenomenon takes place in the new birth, when someone is born again, that there is an entire vocabulary, there's an entire world of the kingdom that they are, in essence, relearning. And so as a preacher, you are helping people to learn the vocabulary of the kingdom, the wisdom of the kingdom, and through preaching, you are helping to associate concepts with words. So they might not have thought about justification or forgiveness or some of these things, and so you are taking those words and helping them to understand them and to associate concepts with these words. And so as a preacher, particularly if you're dealing with someone who is a new convert, part of what you are helping them to do, like a child learning a new language, is to build and develop concepts and to develop vocabulary and to increase understanding and communication through those. And so for preaching, what you're doing often changes depending on who's hearing you. If it's a new convert, part of your sermon is that they're learning words and they're learning concepts. If it's someone in midlife, maybe part of what you're doing is challenging them at the midpoint stage to keep pressing on. If it's someone that's older in life, perhaps you're encouraging them about that season, about the wisdom that they have attained, and helping them to rehearse the promises of eternity and things of that nature. So whatever it is, when you're preaching, there are different audiences hearing different things. But so for this example, just as a child learns new vocabulary, so also does a newborn saint need that experience. Number 5, explain the relevance of the example of a person with amnesia for the preaching event, right? So another story that I told was if somebody has amnesia and you just went up to them and told them their name, that doesn't automatically restore back to them who they were, right? Because a big part of their identity is wrapped up in the memories and the events and the stories that took place in their life, right? So just telling them their name does not restore identity, because their identity is more than just their name. It is the experiences that they've had, the stories that they've been through. And so the important part of that for preaching is that a major part of our identity is found in our stories, right? That if you just tell someone a particular truth, while it is true, it may not help them to understand who they are like a story does. And so this really is about understanding the power of story for a preacher and the ability of stories and incorporating stories into your sermon to help people to build their identity about who they are in Christ. All right. Number 6, what does it mean that you must select how you present yourself in your sermons? So what I'm after here is we had a little bit of a discussion on personal testimony, how transparent you should be, incorporating stories from your own life into your sermons. So I think all of that is good, but it is a decision that the pastor has to make about to what extent they do that. To what extent will they bring in testimonies of, if it's good things that have happened, you want to bring those in. Sometimes you want to be transparent about a weakness that you have, or maybe you're trying to talk about a shared weakness that we all have, and you kind of maybe are a little transparent there about what you've done. And so whatever it is, maybe God used you as a blessing in somebody's life, so you want to tell that story. Whatever it is, you have a decision to make as a communicator to what extent you are going to incorporate your own story into your message here. Okay? All right. Number 7, in your own words, list 2 of the advantages of using well-crafted stories within your sermon. That one I'm going to leave up to you. There's a lot of material that was covered in that lesson on stories. And so I want you to go through and think of 2 advantages that you remember. You might have to go back in and look at that lesson of using well-crafted stories. Number 8. In your own words, list 2 of the advantages of developing a sermon as a series of moves instead of points. Again, this one is one I'm going to allow you to do on your own. Basically, what I'm looking for here is we spent a lot of time talking about crafting a sermon as a series of moves, right? And so what I'm looking for in this question is 2 of the advantages if somebody was to approach sermons from that perspective of developing it as a move, as a fluid movement, as opposed to a series of just points within the sermon, right? Okay. Number 9, in your own words, explain the strength of developing a sermon around a single idea. This kind of goes back to that Andy Stanley book. It's also something that I teach in my own communication style, that you want to have a consistent, kind of coherent, guiding theme, right? And so we've talked about that quite a bit. I want you to, based on either my lessons or what you got out of that Andy Stanley text, talk about why that's an advantage. What are the strengths of that, right? Number 10. How is the pace of change influenced by the size of the audience? So if you remember, I talked about if you're having a conversation one-on-one, you can flip back and forth between conversation topics very quickly, right? If you've got 10 people and you start going that quick, you're going to lose some people. And then if you've got 500 people and you're going back and forth between stuff very quickly, you're even more likely to lose them. So the idea is that the larger the audience, the more deliberate, like turning a giant boat, the more deliberate your change and transition needs to be to make sure that you don't lose people. All right? Number 11. In your own words, explain what it means to have a strategy for each move. All right, so this is another one that I'm leaving for you. the basic idea is that we talked about developing your sermon as a series of moves, but then within each of these moves, you're going to have to develop with creativity and not just be, the same basic format for each one. You want to incorporate different kind of structures, different strategies is the word I'm using here for each move, right? And so I want you to discuss that in your own words a little bit about what it means to have thought through a strategy for each individual move. All right, okay. Number 12. At the beginning of each move, you want to establish what 3 elements, right? So if you remember, we talked just a little bit about this. What I'm wanting here is logic, mood, and perspective. Logic, mood, and perspective. So you're starting a new move. You want to have the logic of why this move is important. We talked about that in the connections discussion, that there is a logic for this new move. But then there is also a mood, right? That is often connected with attitude. What is the attitude you're trying to convey in this move? Is this one of instruction? Is it one of emotional connection? Is it one of surprise, where you're going to bring in some information in the middle of this move that they hadn't thought about? So what is the mood and what is the perspective? We talked about that quite a bit, the point of view. So for each of these moves, you need to think about those 3 things. What is the logic of my move? What is the mood of my move? And what is the perspective of my move? Number 13. What 3 elements of the sermon are generally memorized? If you're going to memorize something, then you don't have to memorize these at all, but just the 3 elements that if you were going to memorize something, this is probably where you would start. Number 1 is clearly the introduction. Number 2, I would say would be the transitions or connections, and in memorizing those, you don't necessarily have to memorize them word for word, but you do need to understand the concept or the logic behind your transition. And then the third one would probably be the conclusion. If you've got some story, illustration, final point that you want to end with clarity and to wrap everything up, then that would be done in the conclusion. So those 3: conclusion, introduction, and transition moments. Okay. Number 14. All right. In your own words, give 3 important points to remember when developing the perspective point of view of your individual moves. All right. So this, I believe, is the last one I've given you to do on your own. This one is going to come from the 3-part series we did on perspective point of view. Really, what I'm wanting there is 3 takeaways that you got. What are the 3 things that you learned from this perspective point of view discussions? Right. Number 15. What does it mean to properly image your ideas? Basically, what I'm after there is with each idea and thought, you want to add a little bit of image to it. You don't want to just say, I walked my dog. You might say, I have a little chihuahua, and I took her out, and we walked down the side of the street, right? And so you add just a few words that help to paint the picture just a little more clearly than, hey, I just walked my dog, right? So I described what kind of dog it was. I talked about what side of the street we're on, or something like that, so that in your ideas you're not just so plain, and you can over-image as well. If you start talking about all these different details and stuff like that, you distract from the point you're trying to make. So you want to image your ideas just enough to where they can kind of picture more clearly what it is you're trying to say. Right. Number 16, list and describe. That should be the 2. List and describe the 2 elements needed when communicating complex issues like sin or salvation. Right. So whenever you're communicating ideas like this, right, things like justification, atonement, something like that, you're really after 2 really important parts. One of them is clarity, right? You want to be able to bring clarity to what you're talking about, right? Because these big complex ideas, if you're not careful, you will assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, and you could have 30 different definitions of what justification means, or glorification, or atonement. You throw out words like that, and they may not even know what you're talking about, half the people, and then the other half think they know what you're talking about, but they have defined it a little differently than you. And so when you get to your point that you're trying to make about that word, a lot of people don't connect with it because how they defined that word was different. So whenever you get to one of these big kind of complex things, you want to have clarity and preciseness. So clarity is, you want to be clear on what you mean by that word. And then preciseness is adding a little specific to it, right? So you want to be clear, you want to be precise, and that's kind of, you don't need to describe those too much. I mean, because we know what clarity and precision are, but give a little brief description about how you can apply those concepts to larger words, more complex words like atonement and things. So the two words are clarity and preciseness, right? And there is some overlap between those concepts. All right, number 17, what is the best way to describe a feeling? I think the best way to describe a feeling is with a situation that everyone can relate to where that feeling comes up. All right, so instead of trying to describe in words, well, I got all happy inside, or whatever, and you're using words to try and describe the feeling, sometimes it's better to take a scenario. So if you're trying to talk about being a proud mother, so instead of trying to describe what that felt like to you physically, perhaps you describe a situation where other mothers will also know what you mean, right? So you talk about them doing the dishes for you or something like that, and you looked over and you see it. And so by describing that, you are describing a proud mother, but you're putting them in a place where, because you're describing it by using a story about it, where they can kind of connect with it too, because they've probably experienced that same type of event. And so I think sometimes the best way to describe a feeling is with a situation that allows everyone to relate to that situation that the feeling arises in, right? Okay, number 18. List and describe the 4 types of orientation for your illustrations. I'm going to give you these 4. You may want to go back in if you don't remember what the definitions were of these, and go back in and look. But it's historical was one of them. So the historical stories, that's a place for your illustrations. That's a type of orientation. The other one is spatial, right? What's going on in the world around you. Social, that's like our relationships and stuff. And then personal, that's kind of your own internal challenges or experiences, right? And then number 19, what concept defines your goal of developing a connection between moves? So this was that last video that we did on connections, and the concept there is you want to keep your sections distinctly separate but yet logically connected, right? Distinctly separate but yet logically connected. Okay. Number 20, explain the advantage of using a consistent metaphor. All right, so I'm looking for here something to the effect that it allows a sense of unity and cohesion throughout your sermon. It allows you to relate all of the points or moves in your sermon back to a consistent idea. Helps to provide a little bit of structure, a little bit of unity to your sermon, right? Number 21, explain the danger of bringing in your illustrations too quickly into your sermon outline. So this is in your preparation. We talked about this as well, that if you bring in your ideas and your illustrations in too quickly into your outline, then you will try then to build a sermon around the illustrations instead of building a sermon around the text and using illustrations to highlight different parts of the biblical text, right? So you don't want to get the cart before the horse. You want to make sure that you are using illustrations to support your biblical principles instead of building biblical principles around whatever illustration you're trying to use. For the most part, that's how you want to do it. I mean, every once in a while there might be some really great metaphor or illustration or something that you're trying to use that you want to build around, but by and large you want the text and the truths of the text to form the core of your outline, and then everything else then comes in to try and illustrate the individual pieces of that, right? Okay. Alright, so that's your final. Go back in. You've got at least 4 or 5 that I want done in your own words that would take a little bit of review on your own part. But if you get this done, you should be fine. I'll give you an hour and 20 minutes for this final because a lot of these are kind of freehand thoughts, your own words and descriptions. So you'll have an hour and 20 minutes for this final.